Today I'm speaking with Dr. Christina Hibbert, a clinical psychologist and Amazon best-selling author of the book, This Is How We Grow. And today we are going to be speaking about coping with grief after someone we love has committed suicide. Welcome, Dr. Hibbert, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So for our viewers that might not be familiar with your personal story, would you mind sharing a little bit about the loss of your dear sister Shannon and your close friend Jody to suicide?
Sure. With Shannon, it's a whole longer story because I never ended up writing a whole book about it. This is how we grow. But essentially, she died in 2007, just a couple months after my brother-in-law had died of cancer. And she died of an overdose of alcohol and Tylenol. And it was the kind of situation where the police call you and they won't tell you what's going on. And my mom went over there to try to figure out what's going on. And then I get the phone call while I'm driving that she had died. And we actually inherited her 2 young sons because they now had no parents. Right. And it was also one of those situations where, because of how she died, she was drunk when she took the Tylenol. She didn't take a whole bottle, but she took enough that it looked like maybe could be suicide or not. Right. Whatever it was one of those things where we had to wait for the autopsy to kind of figure out what exactly had happened. And in my mind, she was drunk and she, made a really bad mistake. Yeah. And then fast forward a couple of years and actually right after my book, This Is How We Grow, came out, several months after, my friend Jody actually left her daughter at my house and she said goodbye to her sons and her husband. And she drove to the Grand Canyon and she jumped to her death. Wow. And so that was even more, not more traumatic, because obviously losing my sister was traumatic, especially we went from 3 to 6 kids almost overnight. Yeah. But the way that she died, it kind of made me almost appreciate that my sister had been drinking when she died. So both have been very difficult in different ways, but suicide is obviously something really hard to deal with, and there's a lot of different kinds of aspects of suicide that we'll talk about.
Yeah, of course. And unfortunately, you've also lost many other people in your family. As you said, due to illness, you lost a brother-in-law, and you also lost a younger sister to cancer. From your personal experience as well as your clinical work, how does grief following a suicide differ from grief following death from an illness or an accident or crime?
It can be, a lot of it's the same, a lot of it's similar. And when it comes to grief has over 100 symptoms. So really, my grief might look different from the next person's, But the extra elements of suicide that I think can make it really difficult is obviously the nature of how they died. And, knowing that they died by their own hand makes it that much more difficult than to cope with versus, you might be angry that your loved one got cancer or something, but that feels more out of your control versus, someone who takes their life, whether they're drunk or not, however it happens. You just think, well, why did you do that? Or there's all these questions, what could I have done? And so there's this element of guilt that can be involved, and there's this element of anger that can be involved at the person who has actually died versus with a normal death, normal quote unquote, where you might be angry that they died, but you're more maybe angry at God or kind of just angry in general versus blaming that person. So to me, those are 2 really big elements that make suicide more difficult to deal with. And because it's often so traumatic, there's that element of trauma. Yeah. Not every death and loss involves a major trauma. It can be obviously traumatic to lose anyone you love, depending on your relationship with them. But by nature, suicide has that element of it's traumatic. Right. So.
Yeah, and you're experiencing all these different emotions of anger and grief that you're trying to work through. And that can be...
Right.
In your blog, you talk about the 12 truths about suicide, grief, and family survivors. Can you just explain what these 12 truths are?
Sure. I mean, these are just kind of something I've come up with related to, as you said, my personal and professional experience. I do work a lot with grief and loss as a psychologist. First of all, it's not something, suicide isn't something that we feel like we can talk about. That makes it hard. There's a silence around suicide that prevents the surviving family members from feeling like they can even say how they died. I mean, I'm sure you've seen on Facebook that so-and-so died and there's no explanation of what happened. Right. And something happened, that it's probably a suicide. So that makes it hard because it's harder to grieve when you can't openly talk about it and feel like you're having to protect sort of a family secret in a sense.
Yeah.
There's also, of course, a huge stigma with suicide. I mean, it's hard enough to understand any kind of death, but suicide is much more difficult for us to comprehend, and there's this kind of idea of maybe that person was selfish, or how could they do that to their family, and I think it's easy for us to forget the underlying illness or mental illness, or in my sister's case, alcoholism, that really are what's feeding into it. Mm-hmm. So that makes it difficult too, because there's that stigma, and that's another reason why people don't want to talk about it. They don't want their loved one to be remembered as the one who took their life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Third, surviving family and friends can often feel judged for how the person died. Feel like, obviously, like I was just saying, you might feel like your loved one's judged, but you might even feel like you're judged. And people just say the wrong things that might make you feel badly worse about what's happened without meaning to, because, again, they don't understand suicide, and so there's a lot of judgment that goes along with that, and that can carry over into the survivors' lives as well.
Right.
Suicide is, because of all these reasons, it's very isolating. It can be very isolating for family and friends. It can be sort of this, you're trying to deal with it on your own, or you're dealing with a certain piece of it in public with those who understand or know what's going on, and then the rest of it, you're kind of doing it on your own, and that can make it very lonely and hard to deal with. Obviously, the impact of suicide reaches far beyond the family. I mean, a lot of times, it impacts the society, the culture, the community where it's happening. There is such a real thing as copycat suicides, or people getting confidence up when they hear that somebody's done this. That happened after my friend Jody died. Another young man in our children's school took his life, and it just was terrible. So there's this kind of impact that reaches beyond just the family too, and that makes suicide a little different than just a regular, quote-unquote, regular death.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned earlier, it's traumatic. So that can lead to complicated grief and a more complicated process of healing. Because you're not only having to just grieve this loss, you're really having to heal from this trauma as well, which can involve some different types of coping and healing. And let's see here, it happens, because of how it happens, that can make it more difficult to cope with because of all these things we're talking about. So whereas, death is hard enough to cope with, suicide just can be that much harder. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned earlier, the anger and the guilt, those are another two of the things that might set it apart. It's easy to feel like you don't want to be angry at the person that you love, but you do feel that way. And then the guilt, of course, I felt some of that. Obviously, I had this thought that maybe my friend Jody was going to do something. And I asked her if she was okay before, and, of course she said she was. And so I believed her. But part of me thinks, well, maybe I should have gone and seen her face and seen what she looked like, but I didn't do that. So, that's normal, and it's okay to feel what we feel, but that can also complicate the grief of suicide. And then there's this spiritual, religious conflict that can come with suicide that doesn't always happen with other deaths, right? Yeah. So, obviously questioning how they could do this, why would God let this happen, where are they going after they die, this kind of thing that makes it really difficult. And whether it's accidental, whether it seemed like it's sort of more accidental, kind of like with my sister, or not, like how it was with Jody, we're left with that big question of why. You don't really know why they felt they were pushed to that limit, or why they would really do that, or what they were really thinking. And so there's just a lot of answers. It's hard to find closure. Yeah. And so the last point is just that I believe we need to talk about suicide. That's why I'm glad we're talking about it today, because it makes it so much easier when everybody feels like it's okay to talk about this and it's not going to make us feel judged or make us feel like we are having some stigma against us if we talk about it, because that's how we heal.
Yeah, it creates a community of support. For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we need that.
Yeah. And how do you talk to children about the death of a loved one who's committed suicide?
First of all, it depends on the child's age. I always say you want to give them as much truth as they can handle for their age in the way that's appropriate for their age. Mm-hmm. So, when, for instance, when my now sons, whom we've adopted, my nephews before, when they were first little, we said it was an accidental overdose. She was drinking, she took tunnel shots. And essentially that's what it was, but it was also suicide. Suicide meaning you die by your own hands, So we didn't really have to explain all of that. They knew that she died because of her choices and what happened. And, it's something where it's kind of every family's decision, but I'm more on the side as a psychologist, especially, and as a mom who's been through it myself, having to teach kids about this and talk with them about it. It's, you've got to kind of do what's right for each child, but also to not try to lie to them or try to hold things back from them. They're going to find out some way or another. Right. So, for instance, when my friend Jody died, my older sons, who are best friends with her older sons, they knew everything that happened, They were teenagers. They knew my daughter, who was 10 at the time, whose best friend was at our house when her mom took her life. She didn't want to know. And she has a really active imagination. She knew that she killed herself, but she didn't know what happened. I don't even think she still knows. She just doesn't want to know because she'll picture it in her head. So, you might not have to give exact details of what happened, but you want to give as much truth as they can handle for whatever age they are.
Right. So you mentioned age being a factor. So would you handle it differently for teenagers?
Yeah, I mean, teenagers are they're going to find out, they're going to know, more. And with teenagers, like I said, I think they can handle more of the truth of what happened. But again, respecting the fact that it's still going to be really hard for them to understand. And they're still, even though they think they're all old and mature and all that, they're really not. They're still coping and they're still going through their own hard time as a teenager. So, again, I think we give them as much truth as possible, but hopefully also give them the skills then to cope with that truth. Making sure they know, I'm here to talk to you. Here's your school counselor. Here's your teachers know. And, making sure that everybody kind of has enough information to provide that support system to scaffold up, the kids as they grow. Because really what happens is kids grow up with grief. They kind of re-experience it at different times of their life as they understand it differently. Right. So it's kind of something where we need to just keep them supported as they're growing up, as they're teenagers, as they move out of the house. So that they know where they can go when, or I would say when, the grief comes back around and they have to deal with it in a new way.
Right. We've really noticed that when someone commits suicide, the fact isn't really usually acknowledged at their funeral or memorial service. And what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, of course I understand why it is so, but I'm literally more of an open book. I mean, I literally wrote my whole story into a book, so I'm more of the, let's talk about, kind of what really happened, but at the same time, at a memorial, I guess you want to focus on their life and who they really were and not the end result. Yeah. So I understand why it happens and why, but I also think it helps to have some kind of an answer for people that are saying, how did this happen? Why did this happen? Because there's such a stigma and because we don't talk about it, people that aren't really close to the family might really have no idea what even happened. Mm-hmm. So it's not like you want to get up at a memorial and say this is exactly what they did, to end their life. But I know at Jody's memorial, I was able to speak at her memorial and being able to just give some words of comfort, I quoted from This Is How We Grow Apart about, how we have these questions of why, and sometimes those questions can't be answered, but we can ask how. We might not understand exactly why this has happened with her, but we can ask how do we carry on? How do we remember her in a way that helps her family? How do we help them? So, I think that can be helpful too, to really at least provide some kind of answer for those who are going, what happened, without maybe just openly talking about exactly what happened, because I'm sure that probably wouldn't be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For our viewers out there who are struggling with grief and anger and feelings of guilt after a loved one has committed suicide, what's your best advice for those people who are struggling?
Well, the best thing I can say is, that's the most common question I get is, how do you grieve these feelings and these losses? And my answer is always the same. It's that you do the grief work. You have to let yourself grieve. And you can actively kind of put that perspective in your head, saying that, it's okay to feel angry. It's okay to feel guilty. It's okay to cry. In fact, it's not only okay, that is the grief work. That is what we have to do. And we have to feel those things. And we have to sit with them a while and try to understand them. And I really think it can be helpful to have a counselor help you through, especially if you're feeling really stuck in one of those emotions, and help you to feel those. Because what happens is we don't want to feel guilty. We don't want to feel angry. We don't want to feel grief-stricken. So we try to push it away, but it doesn't go away. The only way through grief is to go through it. You can't run around it or escape it. Eventually you'll have to go through it. So one thing that I suggest is what I call tears. And this is just 5 easy ways for you to actually actively grieve. And you can just pick one of these each day and do it for a few minutes a day. And so the T is to talk about it, talking about it. And talk with people, obviously, that you trust and that understand. And then E, exercise and activity. I have a brand new book, 8 Keys to Mental Health Through Exercise. And we talk about how exercise really can heal grief. Moving your body and your mind, it helps you get through it. And then we have A, which is artistic expression. So do something creative. Make a collage to remember them. This is great with children. Help them make a memory book or a photo album to remember the one that they've lost. And that really is a good place to channel your grief. R is recording or writing experiences. I'm a fan of journaling, writing down how you're feeling. That helps you to process, obviously. And then the S, which is sobbing. Let yourself cry, sob when it comes, and then feel like you can let yourself feel like you're not going to be able to pull it back together, and trust me, you will.
Yeah.
And if you're really feeling it like you can't pull yourself back together, then I also suggest, again, grief therapy.
Yeah, I really like that term you use, grief work. It is about putting in the work and letting yourself experience what you're feeling, not shutting it down, holding it in.
Exactly. And it's not easy.
No, of course.
That's why it's work.
Work never is, exactly.
That's right.
Would your advice be any different if they were still struggling 10 or 20 years after the suicide occurred?
Yeah, to me that's a sign that there's some complicated grief going on there, and that really that would show me that person probably hasn't moved through the grief process, through those stages of grief or the tasks of grief, however you want to look at it. And that is common. That can happen. It does happen, especially with traumatic types of loss. And that's where you really would want to seek help from a grief counselor or a therapist or psychologist who understands these things to help you kind of know how to go in there. My own mother, when my little sister died of cancer at age 8, my mother, I don't know that she really processed her grief for years after that. And then when my other sister died, I almost felt like she really still hadn't processed the first one. So it was kind of like this complicated and compounded grief that, it's taking a long time to go through. So if the loss is really, really hard for you, if you were really close to that person, if you really, really loved them, it's, grief. I always say grief is a sign that we loved somebody. So it's good to grieve. But unfortunately, our natural response is sometimes to push it away. And that can lead to this kind of long-term grief reaction that really does need probably some professional help too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is it possible to get to a place of grateful, loving joy, to use your expression, when someone has committed suicide, and to leave behind that grief, that guilt, and that pain?
I'm living proof that it is. So it took a long time. I wrote an article you're quoting from about my sister on the day that she died, and I think it was 7 years later. And so it took a long time. But I think that if we do that grief work, that allows us to kind of put everything in the past. And then once we work through the anger, we feel it, we understand it better, we let ourselves express it in healthy ways that aren't harmful to other people or to ourselves. If we can do that with the anger, with the guilt, with those kinds of feelings, then they loosen up, and that's the whole point of feeling it. Feel, to me, is the capital F-E-E-L, which is freely experience emotions with love. So we love ourselves through those emotions, but we keep feeling them, and then they loosen up. And so without the anger, without the guilt, you can be free to remember the person that you loved. And the reason why you were angry and guilty is because you loved them and you miss them, and you can remember the good times. And you don't have to remember how they died. You can remember how they lived, and focus more on that. I really think it takes time and a lot of work, but it is possible. And that's why I say you can feel grateful for having had them in your life. You can feel that love that you have for them, and that can help you feel joy again. So that's why I just made that word up: grateful, loving, joy.
So well put.
Thanks.
I just want to thank you again so much for talking with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
This is Courtney from Love Lives On. Thank you for watching. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more ways that we can celebrate our loved ones' lives now and forever.